I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the middle of a delicate operation involving a bottle of beer and a stack of reports from our latest surveillance job when the doorbell rang. Ordinarily, a ring at the door of the old brownstone on West 35th Street is just a minor annoyance that means I have to get up, but this one had a certain persistence to it. It wasn't the frantic stabbing of a man in trouble or the polite tap of a lady, it was the steady rhythmic pressure of someone who believed they had a legal right to be heard. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:05 a.m. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, where he spent 4 hours a day, 9 to 11 in the morning, and 4 to 6 in the afternoon being intimate with 10,000 orchids. He wouldn't be down for another 10 minutes, and he hates being interrupted by anything short of a fire or a collapse of the beer market. I crossed the hallway, checked the one-way glass in the door, and saw a man who looked like he'd been ironed into his charcoal grey suit. He was holding a briefcase like it contained the secret to eternal life. I pulled the door open, leaving the chain on because you never know in New York. "Yes?" I said, giving him my best busy but not hostile look. "My name is Arthur Galt," the man said. His voice was clipped, the kind of accent that starts in a New England prep school and ends in a corner office at the State Department. "I am here to see Mr. Nero Wolfe. It is a matter of extreme discretion involving the consulate of Maldonia. Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids," I told him. "He doesn't see anyone without an appointment, and he doesn't see anyone at all until 11 o'clock. I'm Archie Goodwin. You can tell me, or you can wait 10 minutes and tell him while he glares at you for existing." Hesitated, then sighed. "I will wait. But I assure you, Mr. Goodwin, every second that passes is a second that the truth is being further eroded." I let him in, steered him to the front room, and went back to my desk to wait for the sound of the elevator. When the rumbling started, signifying that 1/7 of a ton of genius was descending from the roof, I went to the office door. Wolfe entered, his yellow silk shirt stretched across his vast circumference. He didn't look at Galt. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to his desk, checked the vase of spray orchids to see if Fritz had arranged them to his satisfaction, and settled into the only chair in the world that truly fit him. "Archie," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "There is a man in the front room. He smells of desperation and expensive pomade." "That's Arthur Galt," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "He says someone is lying at the Maldonian consulate, and it's bothering his conscience. Or his career. Probably both." Wolfe sighed, a sound like a tire losing air. "Bring him in. But if he intends to discuss international policy, I shall charge him by the syllable." I escorted Galt into the office. He took the red leather chair, the one where hundreds of murderers and liars have sat before He-Man placed his briefcase on his knees. "Mr. Wolfe," Galt began, "I am the Deputy Chief of Protocol for the visiting Maldonian delegation. We are in the midst of negotiating a trade treaty that would stabilize the entire Balkan corridor. However, a document has surfaced, a letter, allegedly written by our lead envoy, Julian Varathat, suggests he is taking bribes from a rival conglomerate." Wolfe shifted his eyes toward Galt, but his head didn't move. "And is he?" "That is the problem," Galt said, leaning forward. "Varro claims the letter is a forgery. But then he claimed the person who discovered it was a spy. Then he claimed the person who reported the spy was actually his long-lost cousin. The man is a compulsive, brilliant, and utterly exhausting liar. He lies about what he had for breakfast. He lies about the weather while standing in the rain. We can no longer tell where the treason ends and the habit begins." "Then fire him," Wolfe snapped. "We cannot. He is protected by diplomatic immunity and the personal favor of the Maldonian Prime Minister. If this bribery scandal breaks and it's true, the treaty dies. If we accuse him and it's false, the treaty dies. We need someone to find the truth behind the Lisomioni, who doesn't exist on an official ledger." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed. I knew the signs. He was weighing the effort of moving against the size of the fee. "You are asking me to navigate a labyrinth built by a professional," Wolfe said. "I do not leave my house, Mr. Galt. I do not investigate in the sense of peering through keyholes or chasing suspects through the park. I am aware of your methods, Mr. Wolfe. I don't want a bloodhound. I want a mathematician. I want someone who can look at a dozen lies and find the one truth they're all trying to hide. Galt reached into his briefcase and pulled out a check. He slid it across the desk. I didn't have to see the numbers to know they had plenty of zeros. Galt's hand wasn't shaking. Wolfe looked at the check for 3 seconds. Archie, record the details. And tell Fritz we shall be having a guest for dinner tomorrow who will likely require a very sharp knife. Not for the meat, but for the atmosphere. Galt blinked. A guest? Who? Mr. Varro, of course, Wolfe said, his voice trailing off as he reached for a book. If he is a diplomat who lies about everything, I wish to see how he handles a perfectly roasted squab. It is very difficult to lie to a man while your palate is being overwhelmed by excellence. Galt looked at me. I just shrugged and took his information. When the front door closed behind him, I looked at Wolfe. A diplomat, huh? This should be fun. Do I get to buy a tuxedo or just a new notebook? Neither, Wolfe said, not looking up from his book. You will go to the consulate this afternoon, Archie. I want you to observe Mr. Varro. Do not speak to him. Simply watch. I want to know if he breathes in rhythm with his falsehoods. Right. Watch a professional liar at a diplomatic cocktail hour. I'll bring my earmuffs. The Maldonian consulate was a limestone fortress on the Upper East Side that looked like it had been built to keep people out rather than welcome them in. I arrived at 4:30, wearing my second-best suit and a tie that whispered respectable but not rich. Galt had left my name at the door under the guise of a freelance security consultant observing the perimeter. The main reception hall was a study in controlled chaos, filled with the murmur of 100 people pretending they didn't want anything from each other. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne, moving like ghosts in starched white shirts. I took a glass, found a spot near a marble pillar that offered a clear view of the room, and settled in to do what I do best, watch. It took me exactly 3 minutes to locate lead envoy Varro. He wasn't the tallest man in the room nor the loudest, but he had that magnetic pull that certain politicians are born with, and the rest spend millions trying to fake. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair swept back from a sharp widow's peak, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. He was holding court near a massive fireplace that hadn't seen a real log since the Hoover administration. Surrounding him was a small orbit of junior attachés, wealthy donors, and people whose job it was to nod at whatever he said. Wolfe had told me to watch him breathe, to find the rhythm of his falsehoods. I sipped my champagne and focused. Varro was telling a story to a stout woman dripping in emeralds. He leaned in, his voice dropping to an intimate register, his hands making smooth, open gestures. The woman laughed, charmed out of her sensible shoes. But I was watching his eyes. They didn't smile when his mouth did. They flicked, just for a microsecond, toward a tall, thin man standing by the window. Varro's chest expanded a fraction too much on the punchline. It was a practiced exhalation. He wasn't just lying to the woman, he was performing the lie for the benefit of the man at the window. The tall, thin man didn't look amused. He had the pinched expression of an auditor who had just found a discrepancy in the ledger. Later, I'd learn his name was Elias Thorne, the delegation's chief financial officer. Thorne caught Varro's eye, gave a microscopic shake of his head, and turned his back. Varro's smile never wavered, but the knuckles of his hand holding a crystal tumbler turned stark white. He excused himself from the emerald woman with a slight bow and moved through the crowd. He didn't go toward Thorne. Instead, he intercepted a younger woman carrying a leather portfolio. She had the hurried, nervous energy of someone who knew too many secrets and was paid too little to keep them. Her name was Clara Finch, Varro's personal secretary. Varro stopped her with a hand on her elbow. His face was a mask of polite inquiry, but the grip was tight enough to wrinkle the sleeve of her silk blouse. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, nodding rapidly as Varro spoke to her in a low, rapid murmur. He wasn't smiling now, he was issuing a command. Clara clutched her portfolio tighter against her chest, mumbled something that sounded like an apology, and practically sprinted toward the rear exit of the hall. Varro watched her go, his jaw set, before instantly smoothing his features back into the genial, charming diplomat and turning to greet a newly arrived senator. I shifted my position, approaching the fireplace. A small mahogany side table sat next to the hearth, holding a silver tray of empty glasses. Tucked beneath the edge of the tray, barely visible, was a folded piece of heavy cream cardstock. It hadn't been there before Varro's conversation with the Emerald Woman. I glanced around. Varro was occupied with the senator. Thorn was still staring out the window. Slowly, casually, I walked past the table, letting my hand brush the surface. The cardstock vanished into my palm, and then into the inner pocket of my jacket. Wolfe didn't pay me to read other people's mail in public. He paid me to bring it home so he could read it from the comfort of his custom-made chair. I set my glass down and slipped out the doors, eager to get back to the brownstone. The brownstone was quiet when I returned. It was 6:15, meaning Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms and was securely wedged behind his desk, presumably anticipating the summons to dinner. I hung up my coat, checked the thermometer in the hall just out of habit, and stepped into the office. Wolfe was reading a book on the history of the Ottoman Empire, his lips pushed out in a silent pout that meant he was either disagreeing with the author or deciding what kind of cheese to have with his beer. I crossed to my desk, sat down, and spun my chair to face him. He didn't lower the book. "I have returned from the circus," I announced, "and I have brought you a souvenir." Wolfe sighed, carefully placed a thin silver bookmark between the pages, and set the heavy volume on his blotter. He focused his eyes on me, opening them perhaps a millimeter wider than usual. "You were instructed to observe, Archie. I did not ask you to commit petty larceny. You asked me to find out if he breathes in rhythm with his lies. I can confirm he does. Varro is an artist. But an artist needs an audience, and his audience is hostile." I pulled my notebook from my breast pocket. Here is the cast of characters: Julian Varro, lead envoy, and our target liar. He performed a lovely fable for a wealthy donor, but he was actually playing to a man named Elias Thorn, the delegation's chief financial officer. Thorn has the warmth of a frozen trout and watches Varro like a parole officer. Then there is Clara Finch, Varro's personal secretary. Varro cornered her, dropped the charm, and gave her an order that terrified her so much she practically ran out of the building. "3 people do not constitute a labyrinth," Wolfe grumbled. "They barely constitute a triangle." "I am not finished," I said. There was also a man hovering near the drinks table who never actually took a drink. Broad shoulders, cheap suit, eyes like a hawk. I asked a friendly waiter. "His name is Victor Drago, officially listed as a cultural attaché, but if that guy knows anything about culture, it's how to beat it out of you in a dark alley. He's Maldonian security, and he was watching Thorn just as closely as Thorn was watching Varro." Wolfe picked up a bottle of beer, poured it meticulously into a glass to achieve exactly 1 inch of foam, and took a slow, deliberate swallow. "So we have a lying diplomat, a suspicious auditor, a terrified secretary, and a security agent observing the auditor, a closed ecosystem of distrust. Under Whodunit." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew the heavy cream cardstock I had lifted from the mahogany side table. I stood up, walked over to his desk, and laid it directly in front of him. Varro received a message. He read it, tucked it under a tray, and went to talk to a senator. I thought you might like to read it yourself. Wolfe did not touch the card. He simply leaned forward, his massive shoulders shifting, and read the typed words. I had read it on the subway ride home, so I knew what it said. "The ledger is balanced, but the vault is empty. Do not attempt the transfer tomorrow. E.T.T." Wolfe murmured softly, leaning back again. Elias Thorn, presumably. A warning from the financial officer to the lead envoy. "It seems Mr. Galt's fears regarding bribery and missing funds are well-founded, though perhaps misdirected in their specifics." "It gets better," I told him, sitting back at my desk. When Varro spoke to Clara Finch, he didn't hand her anything, but he pointed toward the coatroom. 10 minutes after she bolted, Drago, the security guy, also made his way toward the back exits. The entire delegation is playing a game of musical chairs with their own secrets. Wolfe steepled his fingers, tapping them gently against his chin. A man who lies constantly does so to obscure a singular, devastating truth. If Varro is taking bribes, Thorn knows it. If Thorn knows it, why does he warn Varro instead of exposing him to Galt or the Prime Minister? Wolfe closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a deep, rhythmic measure. "Archie, you will need your typewriter. We are going to draft invitations to a dinner party, and you will contact Saul Panzer. I need a man to examine the lock on the Maldonian consulate's rear service entrance without drawing the attention of Mr. Drago. Tuesday morning brought a sky so aggressively clear and blue it practically hurt the eyes, accompanied by a stiff wind cutting off the East River. It was the kind of weather that made you wish you were indoors examining orchids. Since I am merely a hard-working operative with a moderate expense account, I spent the morning freezing my toes on a residential sidewalk in Astoria. Clara Finch lived in a brick 4-story walk-up that smelled vaguely of boiled cabbage. I had arrived at 7:30, planting myself near a newsstand. At 8:15 she emerged. She was wearing a sensible tan trench coat and clutching the same leather portfolio as the day before, gripping it like a flotation device in a choppy sea. I fell into step beside her before she reached the corner, matching her frantic, clipped pace. "Good morning, Miss Finch," I said, keeping my voice pleasant and entirely unthreatening. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. I believe you're carrying entirely too much stress for such a beautiful Tuesday." She jumped, stumbled, and nearly dropped the portfolio. She spun to face me, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and raw panic. "Who? I don't know any Nero Wolfe. Leave me alone or I will scream for a policeman." "If you scream for a policeman, Elias Thorne and Victor Drago will hear about it," I pointed out gently. "Judging by how fast you ran yesterday, official attention is exactly what you want to avoid. Mr. Wolfe has been retained to untangle this diplomatic knot. We prefer to do it without anyone going to jail." She swallowed hard, looking around the bustling sidewalk. Finding no immediate salvation, she slumped against a brick storefront. The fight drained right out of her. "He didn't give me a choice," she whispered. "He told me to go to the secure holding room and take the secondary ledger, the one Thorne isn't supposed to know about. He said if I didn't remove it before Thorne's audit, the treaty would collapse and I would be held responsible under Maldonian treason laws." "Did you take it?" I asked. "I couldn't," she said, tears welling. "When I got to the holding room, the lock had already been tampered with. Someone scratched the brass around the keyhole. I got scared and ran. I don't know what's inside it, I swear." "And the warning note about the empty vault?" I pressed, watching her face closely. Her confusion was genuine. "What note? What vault? We don't have a vault. We use a standard diplomatic safe." Before I could ask another question, my peripheral vision caught a heavy shape, moving against the pedestrian traffic. It was Victor Drago, the cultural attaché, whose culture consisted entirely of blunt force. His eyes were locked on Clara with the warmth of a hunting dog spotting a quail. I stepped smoothly in front of Clara, shielding her from his line of sight. "Miss Finch, walk to the subway. Do not look back. If your boss asks, tell him the ledger is already gone." "Go." She didn't hesitate. She practically vanished down the stairs to the end train. I turned just as Drago closed the distance, planting my feet squarely on the pavement. "Excuse me," Drago said, his voice a gravelly baritone heavily laced with a Slavic accent. "You are standing in my path. It's a public sidewalk," I smiled, keeping my hands loose at my sides. "And you look like a man in a hurry, Mr. Drago. But the lady has a train to catch, and she asked me to make sure large men with bad intentions didn't follow her." His eyes narrowed into dangerous little slits. He assessed me, calculating the physics of moving me out of the way. "You were at the reception. You were a spy. I am a private citizen enjoying the morning air," I countered. "My employer, Nero Wolfe, is hosting a dinner party tomorrow night. He extends his warmest regards. If you put your hands on me, the NYPD will be here in 3 minutes, and they are notoriously uncultured. Your diplomatic immunity might keep you out of a cell, but it won't keep you out of the evening papers." Drago weighed the threat. He knew the papers were poison to the treaty. He took a slow step back, his face a mask of cold fury. "Wolfe," he muttered, committing the name to memory. He turned and melted into the crowd. I adjusted my hat, satisfied with the morning's harvest, and headed toward a phone booth to call Saul Panzer. When I walked back into the office, the clock on the mantel showed precisely 11:05. Wolfe was already there, having descended from the plant rooms with his usual punctuality. He was leaning back in his chair, eyes closed, his fingers joined at the peak of his middle. He didn't open his eyes when I sat down, but his nostrils flared slightly. He can smell the New York City pavement on me from across the room. I waited until I had my notebook ready and my feet comfortably planted on the bottom drawer of my desk before I gave him the report. I told him about Clara Finch panic, the scratched brass of the holding room lock, and my little standoff with Victor Drago. Wolfe remained motionless for a long moment after I finished. Then, without opening his eyes, he spoke. So, the secretary is terrified, the lock is tampered with, and the security agent is prowling the streets of Astoria like a common ruffian. It is a squalid little drama, Archie, a play written by a committee of fools. And yet, the core of the matter remains tucked away. You said Miss Finch mentioned a secondary ledger? One that Mr. Thorne was not supposed to see? That's what she said, I confirmed. But someone beat her. If the lock was already scratched when she got there, then Varro's little errand for her was a setup or a racehead already lost. And then, there's the spice jar. I stood up and walked over to the small kitchen area that Fritz keeps stocked for emergencies. On the counter was a small glass jar of saffron that I had noticed was out of place when I.D. made myself a cup of coffee earlier. It was sitting right next to the electric percolator, far from its usual home in the spice rack. I hadn't moved it. Fritz wouldn't have left it there. He treats his spices with the same reverence Wolfe treats his orchids. Wolfe opened one eye. He looked at the jar. Then he looked at me. The silence in the room suddenly felt very heavy. To an outsider, a misplaced jar of saffron is a nothing. In this house, it's a declaration of war. Fritz did not leave that there, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. He was in the basement larder for 20 minutes this morning, checking the stock of endives. During that time, you were in Astoria, and you were with your orchids, I added. I checked the front door. The chain was on, and the bolt was thrown. Nobody came through the front, but the service entrance has a new scratch on the plate, just like the one Clara Finch described at the consulate. Wolfe sat up straight. This was more than a mere annoyance, it was a physical intrusion into his sanctuary. Someone had entered the brownstone, moved a single item to prove they could, and left without taking a dime or a document. It was a message delivered with diplomatic precision. They are mocking us, Wolfe murmured, or rather, they are attempting to demonstrate that their reach exceeds my grasp. Mr. Varro is more than a mere compulsive liar. He is a man who enjoys the theatre of the hunt. He knows Galt came here. He knows you were at the consulate. And now he knows exactly where we keep our saffron. I walked to the service door and examined the lock again. It's a professional job, Nero. No forced entry. Just a clean pick and a quiet exit. If it was Drago, he's a lot more subtle than he looked on that sidewalk in Astoria. If it was Varro, he's got hobbies he didn't list on his diplomatic credentials. Wolfe gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. It does not matter who it was. What matters is that they have disturbed the peace of this house. Archie, I had intended to wait for the dinner party to apply pressure. I find my patience has evaporated. The intruder did not just move a jar, they moved the timeline. We are no longer observing a mystery, we are participating in a confrontation. He hit the buzzer for the kitchen. When Fritz appeared in the doorway, looking concerned, Wolfe didn't mention the saffron. He simply said, "Fritz, the dinner for tomorrow night. We shall require the shad roe, and I want the table for 5, not 4. We are missing a player, and I intend to find them before the soup is served." Fritz nodded and disappeared. I looked at Wolfe. Who's the 5th? Galt, Varro, Thorne, and Drago make 4. Are we inviting the secretary? No, Wolfe said, his eyes now wide and burning with a cold, intellectual fire. We are inviting the person who actually wrote the note you stole, Archie, because it wasn't Elias Thorne. I reached for the telephone and dialed the number for a small apartment in Chelsea. Saul Panzer doesn't have a fancy office or a listing in the yellow pages, but he has a memory like a filing cabinet and a way of blending into a brick wall that makes him the best operative in the business. When he answered, I didn't waste time with the weather. I told him we had a lockpicker with a sense of humor and a diplomatic trail that was getting muddier by the hour. Wolfe took the extension, his voice crisp and demanding. He gave Saul a list of names and a specific task. Find out where Elias Thorne had been at 3 o'clock that morning, and more importantly, find out who owned the typewriter that had produced the note ID swiped from the consulate. While Saul was out being a shadow, I spent the afternoon at my desk, trying to make the pieces fit. Wolfe sat across from me, motionless, his eyes closed in what looked like a nap, but was actually a high-speed mental calculation. The silence was only broken by the occasional clink of a beer bottle or the scratching of my pen. I kept coming back to the note. If Thorne hadn't written it, then someone was forging a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to the financial officer's door. And if someone had broken into the brownstone just to move a jar of saffron, they weren't looking for money. They were looking for a reaction. Saul checked in at 6:40. I put him on the speaker. His voice was calm, reporting facts with the clinical precision Wolfe required. Saul had spent the afternoon talking to janitors, night watchmen, and a very talkative coat-check girl. He had found the typewriter vintage German model with a slightly misaligned tin, the back office of the Maldonian press attaché, a man named Stefan Horvat who hadn't even been on our radar. More interestingly, Saul had discovered that Elias Thorne hadn't left his hotel room all night, but Victor Drago had been seen entering a pawn shop in Queens that specialized in high-end European antiques. The pawn shop, Saul, Wolfe interrupted, his eyes open. Did Mr. Drago leave with an item or did he deposit one? He deposited a small leather-bound ledger, Mr. Wolfe. Saul's voice crackled over the line. The proprietor said it was written in a shorthand he didn't recognize. Drago didn't want money. He wanted the book kept in a time-locked safe for 48 hours. He paid a premium for the service. Thank you, Saul. Continue your observation of the pawn shop. Do not let that ledger out of your sight, but do not attempt to retrieve it. It is the bait, not the prize. Wolfe hung up and looked at me. You see, Archie, the diplomat lies to obscure the truth, but the security agent steals to control it. And the forger? The forger creates a third reality to distract us from both. So Drago has the ledger Clara Finch couldn't find, I said, leaning back. He's hiding it from his own boss and the auditor. That makes him more than just a bodyguard. He's an entrepreneur. But where does that leave our friend Varro? He's the one who sent Clara to get the book in the first place. Mr. Varro is a man who plays many hands at once, Wolfe said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He sent the girl to the room knowing the book was gone. He wanted her to be seen there. He wanted the tampered lock to be discovered. He is building a case for his own victimization. If the treaty fails, he wants a scapegoat secretary caught in a restricted area, a financial officer implicated by a forged note, and a private detective who was harassed by his security team. I looked at the saffron jar, still sitting on the counter. And the break-in here? Was that Varro too? No, Wolfe said firmly. That was the one variable he did not control. That was an act of desperation from someone who realized that Julian Varro is not the only person in the delegation who knows how to lie. The pressure is increasing, Archie. The pot is beginning to boil. It is time we added our own seasoning to the mix. Call Mr. Galt. Tell him the dinner party is moving forward, and tell him to ensure that Mr. Thorne and Mr. Varro arrive in separate cars. I want them to feel the isolation of their own secrets before they even step through our door. The following morning, the brownstone was transformed into a staging ground for what Wolfe considered the only acceptable form of combat, a meticulously planned social encounter. While Fritz was in the kitchen performing alchemy with Shad Rowe and Sorrel, I was busy with the more mundane task of checking the office for any further messages left by uninvited guests. I examined every inch of the parquet floor and every shelf of the 3 miles of books that lined the walls. Everything was in its place, including the saffron jar, which Fritz had reclaimed with a mutter of disapproval that sounded like a curse in a lost dialect of Swiss German. Wolfe was in a state of glacial composure. He spent the afternoon in his chair, not reading, but staring at the map of the world on the wall, as if he were waiting for a country to move. He had me place 5 chairs in a semicircle facing his desk, a strategic arrangement designed to ensure that no guest could look at another without also looking at him. It was a courtroom disguised as a lounge, and the air in the room felt thick with the impending arrival of 4 men who spent their lives perfecting the art of the poker face. Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes still on the map. You have the note you took from the consulate? Tucked in my wallet, I said. along with the report from Saul about the typewriter with the crooked T and the pawn shop in Queens, were fully loaded. Good. When they arrive, I want you to observe their seating choices. A man who feels guilty will seek the periphery. A man who feels powerful will aim for the center, and a man who is afraid will look at the door. The first to arrive was Arthur Galt, looking even more pressed and anxious than he had 2 days prior. He paced the rug until I offered him a drink, which he declined with a sharp wave of his hand. Next came Elias Thorne and Julian Varro, arriving in separate cars, as instructed. They didn't speak to each other in the hallway. Thorne looked like he had been sucking on a lemon, while Varro radiated a polished, oily charm that made me want to check my pockets for my watch. Finally, Victor Drago appeared, his massive frame nearly filling the doorway. He gave me a look that suggested he was still considering the physics of the Astoria sidewalk, but he followed the others into the office without a word. Wolfe didn't rise when they entered. He waited until they were all seated, Varro in the center, Thorne and Galt on his left, Drago on the far right before he spoke. His voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the glass in the windows. "Gentlemen," Wolfe began, his eyes skimming over them like a hawk looking for a field mouse. "We are here because a treaty is at stake, a ledger is missing, and a series of falsehoods has become so dense that the truth is suffocating. Mr. Galt came to me because he believed Mr. Varro was a liar. Mr. Varro, in turn, has spent the last 48 hours proving him right, albeit in ways Mr. Galt did not anticipate." Varro let out a smooth, practiced chuckle. "My dear Mr. Wolfe, in my profession, a lie is often just a truth that hasn't found its timing yet. If I have been elliptical, it was only to protect the interests of my government from those who might misinterpret a delicate financial transition." "A delicate financial transition is a charming euphemism for a bribe," Wolfe remarked dryly. "But we are not here to discuss your vocabulary. We are here to discuss the fact that someone in this room broke into my house yesterday morning. They didn't come for my beer or my orchids. They came to demonstrate that they could bypass my security, just as they bypassed the security of the consulate holding room." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thorne shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward Varro. Drago remained perfectly still, his hands resting like lead weights on his knees. "I have spent my life studying the patterns of human behavior," Wolfe continued, leaning forward until his shadow loomed over the desk. "A liar will always leave a trail, not because he is careless, but because he is arrogant. He believes he can control the narrative. But a narrative is like a tapestry. If you pull one loose thread, the entire image dissolves. And I have found the thread. It isn't a bribe, and it isn't a ledger. It is a piece of paper that was never meant to be read by the man whose name was signed to it." I saw Varro's hand twitch a tiny, infinitesimal movement of the thumb against his forefinger. It was the first time I'd seen the Diplomat lose his rhythm. Wolfe had set the bait, and the hook was starting to bite. The office atmosphere was no longer that of a room in a comfortable brownstone. It had become a pressurized chamber where the slightest spark would trigger an explosion. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a mountain of immovable intent, while the 4 men before him reacted to the silence in their own telling ways. Galt was sweating openly now, his professional veneer cracking under the strain of the high-stakes theatre. Thorne remained rigid, his face a pale mask of fiscal indignation. Drago was a statue of muscle and suspicion, his eyes never leaving Wolfe's face. And then there was Varro, the man who lied about everything, who sat with one leg crossed over the other, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips, as if he were watching a moderately entertaining play. Wolfe cleared his throat, a sound like a distant rock slide. "The problem with a master of deception," Wolfe said, his voice deceptively mild, "is that he eventually becomes a victim of his own complexity. He starts believing everyone else is playing the same game with the same rules. Mr. Varro, you orchestrated a magnificent charade. You knew the treaty was being undermined by a leak within your own delegation. To find the leak, you created a fictional bribery scandal. You wrote a letter, allegedly from yourself to a conglomerate, and made sure it was discovered. You even sent your secretary on a fool's errand to a room you knew had been breached, all to see who would follow her." Varro's smile broadened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A classic counterintelligence maneuver, Mr. Wolfe. Surely a man of your intellect can appreciate the necessity of smoke when one is hunting a fire. Except, Wolfe countered, his voice sharpening to a blade, that you weren't the only one lighting fires. While you were busy being a plot martyr, someone else was using your smoke to hide a very real theft. Mr. Thorne, you have been remarkably quiet. As the chief financial officer, you were the one who first raised the alarm about the missing funds that prompted Mr. Galt to seek my services. You even sent a warning note to Mr. Vareth note Archie found advising him not to attempt a transfer. Thorne straightened his tie, his voice thin and reedy. I did my duty. I saw a discrepancy and I reported it. The note was a desperate attempt to stop a crime before it became an international incident. A noble sentiment, Wolfe said, if the note were genuine. But that note was typed on a machine belonging to the press attaché, a man you have no official reason to visit. And the missing funds, they aren't missing at all. They were moved into a suspense account by you 2 weeks ago to create the illusion of a bribe that Mr. Varro would then be blamed for. You weren't trying to save the treaty, Mr. Thorne. You were trying to sabotage it because a stabilized Balkan corridor would expose the massive embezzlement you've been conducting for a decade. Thorne opened his mouth to protest, but Wolfe didn't give him the chance. He pivoted his gaze toward the far right, and then we have Mr. Drago, the man of action. You found the real ledger, didn't you, Victor? The one Thorne tried to hide. You didn't take it to your superiors. You took it to a pawn shop in Queens. Why? Not for money. You wanted a hostage. You knew that, as long as you held the proof of Thorne's theft and Varro's incompetence, you were the most powerful man in the delegation. Drago's hand moved toward his jacket, but I already had my desk drawer open, my hand resting on the grip of my Marley, a movement, and froze. But the break-in, Wolfe continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, de saffron jaw. That was the most interesting lie. It wasn't about power or money, it was about fear. Someone in this room realized I was getting too close to the truth. They broke in to see what I knew, and finding my files locked, they moved a jar to rattle me. They wanted me to think they were everywhere. It was a diplomat's trick, executed with a soldier's precision. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes locking onto Arthur Galt, the man who had hired us. Galt's face turned a sickly shade of grey. You, Mr. Galt, Wolfe said. You aren't just a deputy of protocol. You are the forger. You are the one who has been playing both sides, whispering in Thorne's ear about Varro's corruption while telling Varro that Thorne was a spy. You wanted the treaty to fail so your private interests could buy the Maldonian utilities for pennies. You even provided the key for the break-in here, using the impression you took when I first let you into this house. You were the one who lied about everything, including the reason you walked through that door. The silence that followed Wolfe's accusation was so thick you could have sliced it with one of Fritz's paring knives and served it as a side dish. Arthur Galt didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there in the red leather chair, looking like a man who had suddenly realized the bridge he was standing on had been made of tissue paper all along. The sweat on his forehead had stopped being a trickle and was now a steady sheen that reflected the light from the office lamps. Varro, Thorne, and Drago all turned their heads in unison to look at the man who had supposedly been their savior by bringing in the great Nero Wolfe. That is a monstrous fabrication, Galt finally whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. I came to you for help, Wolfe. I paid you a handsome retainer to protect my government's interests. To suggest that I would violate the sanctity of your home or orchestrate a collapse of the treaty I have spent years building is the height of absurdity. You were guessing. You were casting stones in the dark because you have no culprit. Wolfe didn't look offended. He looked bored. He reached for his glass of beer, took a sip, and wiped his lips with a linen handkerchief. I never guess, Mr. Galt. It is a wasteful use of energy. When you first arrived, you were far too eager to paint Mr. Varro as a compulsive liar. You provided a narrative that was almost too perfect, a ready-made labyrinth for me to wander through, but you made a tactical error. You assumed that because I do not leave my house, I am unaware of the mechanics of the world outside. You used a very specific type of pick to enter my service Dora model, favored by the security details of the State Department, where you served for 6 years before joining the Maldonian delegation. It leaves a distinctive spiral scratch on the cylinder plate, a scratch I found yesterday. Many people use such tools, Galt snapped, though his hands were beginning to shake. True, Wolfe conceded, but only one person in this room knew exactly when the house would be empty of its primary occupants. You knew my schedule from our first meeting. You knew Archie would be in Astoria because you were the one who leaked Clara Finch's address to us via a careless slip of paper in your briefcase. And then there is the saffron issue. You moved it to the coffee station. Why? Because during our initial interview you watched Archie make a cup of coffee and noticed he didn't use sugar. You wanted to leave a sign of your presence in the one place you knew he would look first. It was a vanity, Mr. Galt, the hallmark of a man who believes he is the smartest person in any room he enters. I shifted my weight, keeping my eyes on Drago, who looked like he was deciding whether to kill Galt or join him. The room felt like it was shrinking. Varro leaned forward, his polished charm replaced by a cold, predatory focus. "Arthur," Varro said, his voice like silk over gravel. "If what Mr. Wolfe says is true, you haven't just been playing a double game. You've been committing treason against the Prime Minister. The treaty was never about the utilities for you. It was about the commission you were promised by the syndicate waiting to strip our assets." "He has no proof," Galt shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair skittered back across the parquet. "It's all theory. It's all words." "Archie," Wolfe said, not even looking at the standing man. "Please produce the evidence Saul Panzer recovered from Mr. Galt's private safe at the Consulateth, one he opened while Mr. Galt was busy pretending to be a worried patriot in this office. I reached into my desk and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside wasn't a ledger or a letter, but a small brass stamp used for sealing diplomatic pouches, and a set of keys that didn't belong to any door in the consulate. One was a duplicate key to our service entrance, freshly cut. I had spent the last hour before dinner making sure Saul had delivered the goods through the back door while the guests were arriving. Galt looked at the key, and the air seemed to leave his lungs in one long, pathetic hiss. He didn't try to run. He knew Drago was behind him, and I was in front of him. He simply collapsed back into the chair, his face buried in his hands. The diplomat who had lied about everything had finally been silenced by a single piece of cold, hard metal. Wolfe sighed and looked at the clock. "It is 5 minutes past 8. Fritz is waiting. Archie, please call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have a trespasser, a thief, and a very confused diplomat who needs a ride to the precinct. I believe the soup is getting cold." The front door had finally clicked shut behind Inspector Kramer and his disgruntled prize, leaving the hallway filled with the fading echo of raised voices and heavy footsteps. Varro, Thorne, and Drago had departed shortly after, led away in a separate fleet of official cars to face the messy music of a diplomatic internal inquiry. The office was suddenly, blessedly quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the city beyond our limestone walls. The air still held the sharp scent of Galt's, expensive pomade, and the lingering tension of a dozen exposed secrets, but the brownstone was ours again. I walked over to the windows and pulled the heavy drapes shut, sealing us back into our private world. Wolfe hadn't moved from his desk. He was staring at the space where the 5 chairs had stood, his expression one of profound weariness mixed with a sliver of satisfaction. He doesn't enjoy the presence of strangers, but he enjoys being right even more. I started moving the chairs back to their proper places, my heels clicking on the parquet. "Well," I said, pausing with Galt's chair in my hands, "that was quite a performance. I especially liked the bit about the spiral scratch. Was it actually a State Department specialty tool, or did you just want to see him turn that interesting shade of green?" Wolfe looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "The tool was indeed a specific manufacture, Archie, though its provenance is less important than its effect. A man like Arthur Galt is an architect of shadows. He cannot survive the glare of a direct light. He relied on the assumption that I would be too preoccupied with the grand theatre of international treaties to notice a minor disturbance in my own kitchen. It was his greatest arrogance." "The saffron?" I asked, heading toward the kitchen to check on the status of our delayed meal. "Was that really a clue, or just a lucky guess?" "It was a signature," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its usual resonant authority. "In the world of diplomacy, nothing is ever left to chance. To move a jar of saffron was a deliberate act of psychological trespass. It was to tell me my sanctuary was vulnerable. It was a lie in physical form, meant to distract us from the fact that the intruder was already sitting in our office as a client. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face clear of the anxiety that had clouded it all day. He announced that dinner was served, and he said it with the tone of a man who had just saved a kingdom from ruin. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with a precision that would make a Maldonian protocol officer weep with envy. The shad roe was perfect golden, delicate, and accompanied by a sorrel sauce that had just the right amount of bite. Wolfe ate in silence for the first 10 minutes, a sign that the food was meeting his exacting standards. He didn't speak until the last of the roe had vanished, and he was contemplating a small wedge of brie. He looked at the candlelight reflecting in his wine glass and sighed. "Ethics, Archie, are often the first casualty of ambition," he murmured. Mr. Galt believed that because he was navigating a world of professional liars like Julian Varro, his own falsehoods would remain invisible. He failed to realize that truth is not a relative commodity. It is an absolute. One may obscure it with layers of intrigue and forged moats, but it remains at the center, waiting for someone with the patience to peel away the debris. "It's a nice theory," I said, pouring myself a final splash of wine. "But Varro is still a liar, and Thorne is still a thief. The only difference is that Galt is the one who's going to spend the night in a cell." "Precisely," Wolfe replied, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "Justice is rarely a matter of total purity. It is more often about identifying which lie is the most corrosive to the foundation of the house." Mr. Varro's lies were merely a tool of his trade, Mr. Galt's. Lies were a betrayal of the very concept of trust. I find the latter far more offensive to the palate. I leaned back, feeling the familiar comfort of the brownstone settling over me like a warm blanket. Well, at least the saffron is back where it belongs. That's enough of a moral victory for one Tuesday. Wolfe grunted, picking up his cheese knife with a steady hand. "Go to bed, Archie, and tomorrow morning tell the man who delivers the newspapers that if I see another headline regarding Maldonia, I shall hold him personally responsible for the decline of Western civilization."